Edward VIII has long been known as the British king who gave up the throne to marry the woman he loved. American divorcee Wallis Simpson. But declassified FBI files reveal a potentially more damning legacy, that Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson were pro-German in the heyday of the Nazi regime, that they maintained contact with Hitler's Germany early in the war and may have leaked vital secrets to the enemy, and that Hitler wanted to see Edward return to England as his puppet king. These files now tell the real story of how the British and American governments saw them as a potential liability to national security and went to extraordinary lengths to keep watch over them. Britain's at war with Nazi Germany. Winston Churchill is desperate for the United States to join the Allies. President Roosevelt is sympathetic. But America needs persuading. And the most famous couple in the world, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, are coming to her shores. But they're suspected of being pro-German. Roosevelt instructs the FBI to spy on them as they arrive in Miami.
Roosevelt knows that they're dangerous, and he has the FBI follow them about and intercept their mail, and there's a very large security operation.
To the public, they're glamorous. But to the authorities, they're a security risk.
He'd always admired Hitler. He was, frankly, very pro-Nazi.
In America, there's a powerful lobby against joining the war. Churchill can't afford any negative publicity from the Windsor's visit. So he sends his PR man to Miami for spin control.
And the Duchess and I are naturally very glad to set foot in America again.
Every move they make is monitored. Even their dry cleaning is inspected. In 2002, the FBI releases the Windsor's file under the Freedom of Information Act. It totals 227 pages.
For some time, the British government has known that the Duchess of Windsor was exceedingly pro-German in her sympathies and connections. And there is strong reason to believe that this is the reason why she was considered so obnoxious to the British government. They refused to permit Edward to marry her and maintain the throne.
The FBI gets some of their information on the Windsors from British intelligence, who began trailing the couple as early as 1935. The Duke is then the Prince of Wales and heir to the throne. British detectives know that Wallis Simpson is a divorcee who is remarried and is now carrying on an affair with the prince, and maybe a few others.
She was regarded as a person very fond of the company of men, and to have had many affairs. She was with different men at these addresses.
The British Secret Service were watching the Windsors pretty closely and reporting on their every movement.
The detectives discover another of Wallis's lovers, Guy Trundle, a 36-year-old car salesman. While under secret surveillance, Wallis introduces the heir to the throne to a range of infamous characters, including the scandalous socialite, Lady Emerald Cunard. The detectives describe her as
a drug addict, a mother of notorious Nancy Cunard, who is very partial to colored men and who scandalized society by living in a Negro district of New York.
Lady Cunard introduces Prince Edward to Sir Oswald Mosley, leader of the British Union of Fascists, who had started a violent riot in London in 1936.
Edward inquired as to how many supporters Mosley had for his British Union of Fascists.
But even more dangerous fascists are eager to meet the prince, and especially his new lover. Through Lady Cunard, Wallis is introduced to an ambitious German diplomat called Joachim von Ribbentrop. Hitler has appointed Ribbentrop as Germany's special envoy to Great Britain, He's tasked with building a strong alliance between the two countries. Wallace later claimed in her autobiography that she only met Ribbentrop twice, but according to the FBI files, they had an affair. The FBI interview Edward's distant German relative, Duke Karl Alexander of Württemberg, about the affair.
He knew definitely that von Ribbentrop, while in England, sent the then Wallace Simpson 17 carnations every day. The 17 supposedly represented the number of times they'd slept together.
There were widespread rumors that they were romantically involved, and I don't think it's possible to prove that was the case, but that was certainly the buzz in these circles.
The FBI files claim that Wallace stays in contact with Ribbentrop for many years to come. This will later prove invaluable to Hitler when he wants to forge a link with Prince Edward, the heir to the British throne.
Hitler was trying to develop a relationship with Edward with the goal of ultimately manipulating him, using him to form this Anglo-German alliance.
While Ribbentrop rises quickly through the ranks to become Hitler's foreign minister, Wallace's Nazi sympathies and ongoing involvement with him ruins her reputation in the eyes of the British establishment. An establishment that will ultimately force Prince Edward to choose between his love and his crown. But before Prince Edward fell for Wallace Simpson, he was the most eligible bachelor in the world. A fearless horseman, athlete, and pilot, he brings a new kind of celebrity to the monarchy. The British public is entranced.
He wore these sort of rather ridiculous clothes, and he winked awfully well, and he grinned slyly out of the side of his mouth, and everybody rather loved it, you know.
He was good-looking and boyish and approachable and charming, and the crowds loved him.
He's at the forefront of fashion and makes his own Windsor knot a hit.
He was a handsome playboy with a lot of charm, and a wonderful contrast to his father, King George V, who never cracked a smile at all, ever, and never told, as far as I know, a joke. If he did, I bet it was a very bad one.
Prince Edward is born June 23, 1894. His childhood is harsh and disciplined. He serves in both the Royal Navy and the Grenadier Guards.
I think he got it into his head that he was a wonder boy, really, and that the duties were something that were put upon him.
Unlike his father, George V, Prince Edward likes to travel. One of his earliest trips is to Germany in 1913, where he has close family ties.
The family saw themselves as German. They were very comfortable speaking German at home, and Edward on several occasions referred to German as his mother language, as his Muttersprache.
In 1917, Edward's father, George V, changes the family name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor.
This was an attempt to make the family appear more English, and of course they fabricated the name of Windsor. They took it from one of their castles, and it's purely invented.
Prince Edward tours the far-flung corners of the globe. He's the face of the British crown abroad, and he's enormously popular.
Let me emphasize his overpowering capacity when he chose to use it to make people practically fall down in his path and kiss his feet. The effect was remarkable.
His adventures abroad are captured on film and enthrall the British public, who are more accustomed to stuffy formality from their royal family.
He was mobbed. He was treated like Prince William today times 10. He was constantly having women fling themselves at him, and he was being cheered to the echo. And so as a result, of course, this is going to inflate his ego.
But these movies only tell part of the story.
He could charm birds off trees, but it doesn't stop him behaving badly. There are records of his many trips to India where he behaved disgracefully and sort of walked out of public ceremonies and refused to meet the people he was required to meet.
Sir Alan Lascelles, his assistant private secretary, later writes,
I camped and tramped with him across Central Africa, but by 1927 my idol had feet of clay. When we got news from Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin of his father's grave illness, the Prince said, I don't believe a word of it. It doesn't mean a thing. He went without a word and spent the remainder of the evening in the successful seduction of a Mrs. Barnes, wife of the local commissioner. He told me so the next morning.
Stories of Edward's behavior abroad reach the ears of the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin. He starts questioning whether the prince is really cut out to be king. Alan Lascelles' diary tells of a candid meeting he has with the Prime Minister.
You know, sometimes when I sit waiting to hear about some point-to-point in which the Duke is riding, I can't help thinking that the best thing that could happen to him, and the country, would be for him to break his neck. God forgive me, replied Baldwin. So do I.
The adoring British public knows nothing of Edward's many affairs, especially with married women.
I think he preferred the married ones. It was kind of safer and they knew what they were about and they wouldn't make trouble for him.
His first confirmed affair begins in 1915 with Marion Coke, who's 12 years his senior. Then in 1918, Frida Dudley Ward.
One of his mistresses, called Mrs. Dudley Ward, sought to improve his mind a little bit by lending him the novel Jane Eyre. And some time went by, and then he brought it back to her, handed it back to her, and said, I can't get on with this at all. Can't get on. Who are these Bront people, anyway? Which showed the depth of his ignorance and lack of culture.
Edward moves on to Mildred Harris, the ex-wife of Charlie Chaplin. And in 1930, it's Lady Thelma Furness, who introduces him to her friend, Wallis Simpson.
Poor Thelma Furness was really betrayed by Wallis. When Thelma Furness went abroad, she asked Wallis to look after the little man. And when she came back, she found how well Wallis had looked after the little man.
While Edward insists his relationship with Wallis is entirely proper, his staff reports seeing them in bed together.
Edward, when he told his father, George V, that Mrs. Simpson was not his mistress and their relations were absolutely pure, poor King had to believe it, but I think everybody knew.
Wallis Simpson is born Bessie Wallace Warfield in Pennsylvania in 1896.
You could say she was a gold digger. I mean, she was one of those women who can only see their way through marriages to rich men.
Twice married, Wallis is believed to have once had an affair with Count Galeazzo Ciano, who would later become Mussolini's son-in-law. It's rumored she became pregnant by him and had an abortion which left her unable to conceive. Wallis is still married to her second husband, Ernest Simpson, when she begins her affair with Edward. The king is in despair. He prefers his heir to marry just about anyone but Wallis Simpson.
The British royals were extremely dismayed by Edward's relationship with Wallis Simpson. They always understood that he would have affairs, and they knew that he had a penchant for married women, in fact. But Wallis was just, beyond the pale, if you will.
But Edward's devotion to Wallis isn't swayed. He showers Wallis with lavish gifts, especially jewelry costing tens of thousands of dollars. Emeralds are her favorite.
She did give the impression of being terrifically tough. Funny, quick, amusing, wonderful sense of humor. She was always said to have said, at the height of the abdication crisis, darling, you must understand, you can't abdicate and eat it. It's a very good line.
It appears that he enjoys being dominated by her. One account describes how Wallis makes Edward beg like a dog for cigarettes. An FBI statement taken from Edward's relative, Father Odo, recalls how Wallis once told a public party that
The Duke is impotent, and although he'd tried sexual intercourse with numerous women, they'd been unsuccessful in satisfying his passions. The Duchess had been the only woman able to satisfactorily gratify the Duke's sexual desires.
By 1935, the growing intimacy between the American divorcee and the heir to the throne piques the interest of British intelligence agents. And they're not the only ones paying attention. Hitler sees Wallace enter a relationship with von Ribbentrop as a path to get close to Edward.
When he saw the heir to the throne as someone who could potentially be manipulated, Hitler really devoted a great deal of interest and energy in this regard.
Hitler had long seen the impressionable prince as a potentially useful ally to Germany. Now his relationship with Wallace might be the opening Hitler has been looking for. On January 20th, 1936, King George V dies. The Prince of Wales becomes King Edward VIII.
He had a sense that he was more than a figurehead, certainly, and more than a constitutional monarch. He had an inflated sense of what a monarch should do. And it was to become a pattern later on that he would cross the line that has existed in the United Kingdom for centuries and become involved with politics in ways that his ministers, at least, found very problematic.
But for Hitler, it's music to his ears. On the day of Edward's ascension, the German ambassador, Leopold von Hirsch, writes to Berlin.
He feels warm sympathy for Germany. I am convinced that his friendly attitude towards Germany might in time come to exercise a certain amount of influence on the shaping of British foreign policy.
But even von Hirsch couldn't have imagined how the new king's sympathy for Germany would ultimately help to end his reign so quickly. Hitler wants the support of the new British king, Edward VIII. For years, Hitler's gained huge popularity in Germany by promising to tear up the hated Treaty of Versailles, which ceded the control of the Rhineland to the French and British. And now, he's ready to take the land back. Edward is adamant that Britain should avoid any conflict. He ignores the government and begins talking directly to the German ambassador.
He would hold political conversation with the German ambassador, which he never should have done.
Edward is overstepping his role as king. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin grows increasingly alarmed.
Baldwin recognized Edward as being very dangerous and very disruptive. And remember, at this time, in March 1936, Edward is a tremendously popular king.
Edward threatens Baldwin that he will give up the crown should he decide to oppose Germany. In one of his many calls to German Ambassador von Hirsch, he supposedly says,
I sent for the Prime Minister and gave him a piece of my mind. I told the old so-and-so that I would abdicate if he made war.
Hirsch relays the news to Berlin.
The reassurances from King Edward VIII that Britain wasn't going to fight was crucial. Hitler had a kind of, you would say in American, with American poker, an ace in the hole, if you will, knowing what he did from Edward at this time.
On March 7th, 1936, Hitler's troops crossed the border and reclaimed the Rhineland for Germany. England doesn't put up a fight. France and the rest of Europe stand back and watch.
It was a huge coup for Hitler. He sent troops in, and the rest of the world did nothing, even though it was a ripping up of the Versailles Treaty. And so really, we were then on the road, the Via Dolorosa, through to the disasters that took place in 1937 and, of course, 1938 and 39.
6 months later, King Edward takes his divorcee lover away on a cruise around the Mediterranean. John Julius's parents, Lord and Lady Cooper, have their home movie camera with them on the boat.
My father sat next to Mrs. Simpson and knew all about what was going on. And he wrote in his diary, "I think she's probably a nice woman and she's an intelligent woman, but she's hard as nails and doesn't love him."
Jim Wallace, now Lord Dudley, is also on the cruise.
My father was a great friend of the king, as he then was. So I saw quite a lot of them on that trip. She wasn't, I thought, particularly pretty. Certainly to me, she didn't appear to be physically attractive. I thought she was a rather tiresome woman, and I couldn't quite see what the attraction was.
The British public back home know nothing of the affair. Reporting on the personal lives of royalty is taboo.
Magazines were censored. Photographs of Edward and Wallis were cut out of magazines before they were allowed into England. I mean, it was quite heavy.
Europe and America are absorbed by the story of the king and the American divorcee. But the scandal doesn't break in England for another 4 months. When the media bombshell of the king's romance does finally break in England, the conversation immediately turns to marriage.
In those days, divorce was a... I mean, you know, if you'd been divorced once, you weren't allowed into the royal enclosure at Ascot. She'd been divorced twice.
But by the time the British press exposes the story, Wallis has already written to Edward to call off their affair.
This is a difficult letter to write. In a few months, your life will run as it did before, without my nagging. I'm sure you and I would only create disaster together. I want you to be happy. I feel sure that I can't make you so, and I honestly don't think you can me.
But Edward's reply changes her mind.
Why do you say such hard things? I'm hurt and terribly unhappy and bursting with love and such longing to hold you tighter than I ever have before.
Wallis returns to Britain and to Edward. As king, Edward is also head of the Church of England. For him to marry a woman twice divorced is morally unacceptable. He would have to abdicate, give up the throne and his birthright in order to marry her.
The majority of the British public hated the idea of his abdicating, but they thought he shouldn't put this divorced, middle-aged American woman before his duty to his country. I think that's what they thought.
Edward is king. But according to the British Constitution, it's the Prime Minister and Parliament who actually rule Britain.
I think he was boxed into a bit of a corner by Baldwin and the government of the day, and I think he thought he was going to find a solution and then got himself into a corner in which he couldn't get out except by abdicating.
The tale of Edward's abdication is always centered around his romance with Wallis. But declassified FBI files suggest that his desire to marry Wallis may have just been a convenient smokescreen for the government to oust him from the throne.
The British government were anxious to get rid of the Duke of Windsor, first and foremost because of his fondness for Nazi ideology.
If Edward steps down, the crown goes to his younger brother, Albert.
Baldwin could clearly see the positive side to this crisis, and I think Baldwin thought Albert preferable to Edward. Undoubtedly, that was the case.
It's the first time in British history that the king chooses to give up the crown.
I was deeply shocked that he should have given up a country and a great empire for this woman who I said didn't figure very highly in my estimation.
Wallis flees to France.
She left London because after the thing came out, people threw stones at her house and shouted, so she really fled.
On December 10, 1936, Edward VIII signs the official instrument of abdication. He has reigned for less than a year.
At long last, I am able to say a few words of my own. That I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do. without the help and support of the woman I love.
Edward's younger brother and the father of today's reigning monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, takes the throne and becomes King George VI. Edward leaves the country. England may have gotten rid of a liability. Edward is no longer king. But Hitler sets to work to change all that. Edward is no longer the King of England. Now he's free to marry the woman he loves. Edward Windsor and Wallis Simpson marry at the Chateau de Condé in France on June 3, 1937. The royal family boycotts the wedding. Edward's new title is His Royal Highness the Duke of Windsor. Wallis is simply the Duchess of Windsor. It's decided that she can't use the title, Her Royal Highness.
It did make the Duke of Windsor very bitter. He never forgave his family for this, and this was the subject till death of the real row between George VI, the Queen Mother, and the Windsors.
With the Windsors away from England, the Duke's outspoken views and careless talk become more of a liability. At a party in Vienna in June 1937, a young American diplomat confides in Edward that the Americans had finally cracked an Axis intelligence code. But soon, the Duke's loose tongue gives away this prized information at a party thrown by an Italian diplomat.
This was a real blunder. It was very problematic. The fact that the Americans are listening to you or have cracked your codes, and that had serious implications.
The leak confirms President Roosevelt's long-held suspicions about the Duke. The Duke and Duchess are falling into bad company. The chateau where they were married is on loan to them by the Duke's close friend, Charles Badeau, an industrialist and suspected Nazi sympathizer.
Charles Badeau is still a very mysterious individual who evidently was a Nazi spy who was sending reports back to the Reich.
In October 1937, the Windsors make another controversial move. They visit Germany on the Nazis' dime.
British politicians were somewhere between apprehensive and horrified at the thought of Edward and Wallis going on this tour.
Berlin. A huge crowd greeted the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, and they were specially welcomed by Dr. Lai, the Reich's organization manager.
Hitler rolled out every red carpet that he could, gave them a tremendous slap-up time and buttered them up like nobody's business.
Later in the day, the Duke attended a workers' concert.
He was fawned on by all the Nazi leaders and thought this was fine.
The Windsors dine with senior Nazis. Goebbels writes,
"It's a shame he is no longer king. With him, we would have entered into an alliance."
Edward is even invited into Goering's home. The two men play with a toy train, set up for Goering's nephew. An airplane flies across the room on a wire, scattering wooden bombs on the trains below.
Even though Edward was no longer king, the Germans saw him as not just an ally, but someone who could be effectual, who had extraordinary relationships, who was still taken seriously in certain quarters.
The highlight of the trip comes on October 22nd, when they meet Hitler at his mountain retreat.
When Hitler receives the Duke and Duchess of Windsor at the Berghof in Ober-Salzburg, Wallis is completely charmed by Hitler. He addresses her as Your Royal Highness, which thrills her, and you can see that there's a real, that the meeting goes extremely well.
Hitler's translator recalls that the Fuhrer remarks, "She would have made a good queen."
The Duke of Windsor always thought that some sort of accommodation would be possible. even when everybody else knew that it was out of the question.
By the spring of 1939, the British abandoned the policy of appeasing the Nazis. But the Duke still records a radio statement pleading for peace with Germany. The BBC refuses to broadcast it. A few months later, on September 3rd, Britain declares war on Germany. The Duke is stationed in France and given the rank of Major General. He's assigned the task of liaising between the British and the French.
It wasn't a real job. It was a job that any number of other people were doing much more effectively.
British authorities don't trust Edward. He's kept away from any real intelligence. The Duke realizes what's happening, and he's outraged. He fires off a stream of letters to Churchill blaming the king.
Being merely fresh evidence of my brother's continued efforts to humiliate me.
He taunts British intelligence services by writing on the envelope.
To whomsoever steams this letter open, I hope you are as edified at the contents of this letter as I am over having to write them.
Edward's anger toward the British government opens a door for the Germans. On January 27, 1940, the German minister at The Hague, Count von Zech-Berkesroder, writes,
"The Duke has openly expressed dissatisfaction about his treatment, which has given me the opportunity to establish lines leading directly to him."
With Hitler's armies now marching across Europe, the stakes are raised. The Duke's indiscretions could have serious consequences. The Germans are revving up to invade France. The Allies predict the attack will come from one of three possible points. The lowlands of Belgium, ideal for Hitler's tanks, the heavily defended Maginot Line, or through the densely wooded Ardennes. Hitler plans to attack across the lowlands and dispatches his battle plans by plane. But it crashes in Belgium. The pilot attempts to destroy these critical papers, but the Germans aren't sure whether they've fallen into Allied hands or not. So Hitler is forced to stand down 50 divisions and wait. What happens next leads some to believe the Duke may have inadvertently leaked information that influenced Hitler's strategy. In a few short days, Hitler does a 180 and sends his tanks through the lightly defended Ardennes instead. German armies swarm into France, and by May 1940, they're at Paris's doorstep.
It is remarkable that Hitler and the Germans attacked just in the right place. Hitler and the Germans could not have done it any better. It was absolutely spot-on brilliant. But certainly allegations have been made against the Duke and Duchess of Windsor that they either knowingly or unknowingly helped the Germans in this regard.
When the Nazis invade France, the Duke of Windsor doesn't evacuate with his regiment. He and Wallace flee south to Biarritz instead. His close friend and assistant, Major Metcalfe, returns to their quarters to find the Duke has stripped them bare and taken all the cars. He writes,
"He has run like two rabbits. He deserted his job in 1936. Well, he's deserted his country now. It's the end."
But the Duke isn't done yet. And for Winston Churchill, the chase is on. By the summer of 1940, Hitler's armies have taken the Low Countries and France. The Windsors are still at large in Europe, and Hitler wants to know if he's got an ally in the Duke. Hitler believes the Duke can help divide opinion in Britain and lead a pro-German lobby.
I think it's clear that Hitler wanted to maintain the goodwill of the Duke and Duchess, and that the Duke of Windsor could be helpful in negotiating a peace and then perhaps ultimately playing a role as the sovereign, as the monarch of the United Kingdom.
Declassified FBI files contend that the Duchess continues to communicate with the Nazis via Foreign Minister von Ribbentrop. even as the war escalates.
The Duchess was obtaining a variety of information concerning official activities which she was passing on to the Germans.
Within minutes of checking in at Biarritz, the location of their hotel is broadcast on German radio. The FBI believes the Duchess informed von Ribbentrop of their destination in advance. Berlin radio proudly announces not only the name of their hotel, but even their room number. While France falls and thousands of British soldiers evacuate Dunkirk, Wallace keeps German officials apprised of their whereabouts. Then, Italy declares war on France, and the Duke and Duchess flee south again.
The Windsors had to leave the country, and instead of coming back to Britain, which is what they should have done, they went to fascist Spain, and they fell in with a large number of pretty dodgy people, dodgy businessmen, fascists, really the detritus of society.
Berlin is abuzz with news of the Windsors' arrival in Madrid. With France now in German hands, Hitler thinks Edward can be used to urge the British people to accept German occupation, with him returning as their king. The Nazis just need to grab him.
There was a German plan to send in paratroopers and kidnap the Duke and Duchess. And Winston Churchill was very keen indeed to get them back to Britain and out of harm's way.
Hitler's plan to use the Duke as a puppet king isn't so far-fetched. An American ambassador overhears one of the Duke's conversations and writes to the U.S. Secretary of State in alarm.
The Duke of Windsor declared that the most important thing now to be done was to end the war before thousands more were killed or maimed to save the faces of a few politicians.
Churchill orders the Duke back to Britain or face a court-martial.
The Duke and Duchess of Windsor show themselves pretty much at their worst in this period, when they are making up any kind of excuses for not coming home.
Churchill sends them to Portugal to keep them away from the Nazis.
There's this cat-and-mouse game between both sides as they try to secure the Windsors for their own purposes.
The Duke and Duchess cross the Portuguese border and head for Estoril. And more trouble.
Portugal was neutral at that time, and I think that the concern of Winston was really that Estoril was rather a hotbed of German spies and one thing and another.
This time they're put up by a wealthy Nazi supporter named Ricardo Silva.
They were fascists. He didn't like that. He felt quite at home with that. The Duke of Windsor rather liked sort of hanging about the swimming pool of this rather right-wing Portuguese banker.
Then on July 11th, another controversy erupts. The German ambassador in Lisbon tells Berlin,
the Duke believes with certainty that continued heavy bombing would make England ready for peace.
Hitler had the idea that the bombing of the United Kingdom would send people into a panic and would induce the British people to turn against the rulers. That there would be an opportunity to bring the Duke of Windsor back as the sovereign.
Churchill must get rid of the Windsors, and fast. He settles on the Caribbean. On August 1st, 1940, the Duke and Duchess sail west to the Bahamas and to exile. Frank Giles, a young diplomat, is sent to welcome the couple when they come ashore.
When we arrived at Government House, after the ceremonies were over, he came into my study and said, why did no one curtsy to my wife? Who ordered this? So I simply handed him a copy of the cable that we had received from London, in which these instructions were set forth. And he looked at it, and his face darkened, and he said, this is all the Queen's doing. My brother is all right, The Queen is behind this, and left the room in a rage.
The Duke and Duchess have been removed from Europe by their government, estranged from the royal family. And now they're exiled on a Caribbean island. The man who was once King of England is now nothing but an inconsequential governor. Even so, his outspoken views could still pose a threat to national security. It's 1 year into the Second World War. Britain's former king is now seen as such a liability. He's been sent into exile 4,000 miles away from Britain. The man who had once commanded an empire is now governor of the Bahamas.
If Churchill had rated the Duke of Windsor highly, he would have got something really significant, like Canada or Australia, one of these really important jobs, or Viceroy of India.
Instead, the Duke is in charge of a chain of scattered islands covering an area just half the size of Wales. The Duchess is unimpressed with her new home.
I hate this place more each day. We both hate it. The locals are petty-minded. The visitors common and uninteresting.
Even in this remote location, Churchill isn't taking any chances. He warns the Duke.
May I venture a word of serious counsel? It will be necessary for the governor of the Bahamas to express views about the war and the general situation which are not out of harmony with the British government.
But Edward ignores him. In December 1940, he gives an exclusive interview to American journalist Fulton Oursler, editor of Liberty magazine and friend of President Roosevelt. Oursler asks the Duke about the rumors of a revolution in Germany, and Edward replies,
"There will be no revolution in Germany. It would be a tragic thing for the world if Hitler were overthrown. Hitler is the right and logical leader of the German people. He is a great man. Tell Mr. Roosevelt that if he will make an offer of intervention for peace, that the Duke of Windsor will instantly issue a statement supporting it. And that will start a revolution in England that will force peace."
It's considered the greatest news story on earth, but it never sees the light of day. The interview is considered too inflammatory to distribute. 4 months later, the Duke and Duchess visit Miami. Churchill and Roosevelt are on high alert. The FBI puts the Windsors under 24-hour surveillance. They closely monitor every dinner they attend, every call they make, every golf course they visit. The FBI builds a thick file on the Windsors, painting a damning picture of their behavior and the potential threat they pose.
Clearly, the outlines of this history become evident, that the Duke and Duchess were pro-German, were sympathetic to National Socialism, wanted to negotiate a peace, wanted to come back to and return to the throne in the United Kingdom.
In March 1945, the Duke announces his resignation of his Bahamas post, months before his term is officially over. But before leaving the Bahamas, the Duke is overheard saying,
"After the war is over and Hitler has crushed the Americans, we'll take over. The British don't want me as their king, but I'll be back as their leader."
The Duke and Duchess, now unwelcome in England, settle in France, where they live out the rest of their lives in a lavish house near Paris. Frank Giles later finds the Duke hasn't given up his shocking political rants.
It must have been the middle 50s. When Eden had become Prime Minister, he said, Eden, he really helped to bring the war on. And then there was a short pause, and then he added, and of course Roosevelt and the Jews. And I thought this was such an outrageous thing to say that I seriously thought of leaving the room.
Some members of the royal family never forgive them.
It even said that when Edward did go and see his brother George VI at Buckingham Palace, that the Queen Mother would disappear. She didn't want to see him. They all regarded it as a terrible betrayal.
Edward dies in 1972. He's buried at Windsor Castle. Wallis dies in 1986 at the age of 90. She's buried next to him. Her headstone reads simply, Wallis, Duchess of Windsor. She was never given a royal title. The romance of the handsome young king who gave up his throne for the love of an unsuitable woman is just one version of the story. The official position is that His Royal Highness never wavered in his loyalty to the British cause, but Edward's critics see him as a Nazi sympathizer instead. When Edward gave up the crown, he brought shame to the royal family. But perhaps, as his critics contend, if he remained king, the consequences for Britain would have been far worse.